The morning mist clung to the red clay hills surrounding Khe Sanh combat base like a shroud, carrying with it the scent of diesel fuel and the distant echo of artillery. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez crouched behind a sandbag fortification, his weathered hands gripping his M16 rifle as he scanned the tree line, barely 300 meters away. It was January 20th, 1968, and something felt different in the air tension that made even the most seasoned Marines uneasy. The base sat strategically positioned just 14 kilometers from the demilitarized zone, a lonely outpost carved from the jungle highlands near the border with North Vietnam. Colonel David Lones commanded the 26th Marine Regiment, tasked with holding this vital position against what intelligence reports suggested was a massive North Vietnamese army buildup in the surrounding hills. The irony wasn't lost on Rodriguez as they were defending a piece of godforsaken real estate that most Americans couldn't even pronounce correctly. Sergeant Rodriguez, movement on the perimeter, whispered Lance Corporal Tommy Chen, his voice barely audible over the constant hum of generators powering the base's communications equipment. Rodriguez adjusted his binoculars, focusing on the dense vegetation where shadows seemed to dance between the trees. The jungle had eyes, and those eyes had been watching them for weeks. The strategic importance of Khe Sanh couldn't be overstated in the context of the Vietnam conflict. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, believed the base served as a crucial listening post and launching pad for operations into Laos and North Vietnam. The Marine garrison of approximately 6,000 men represented America's commitment to maintaining a foothold in this contested region, despite the logistical nightmare of supplying such a remote position. According to detailed accounts from the New York Times archives, the buildup of North Vietnamese forces around Khe Sanh had been detected through various intelligence channels throughout late 1967. Intercepted communications suggested that General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier, was orchestrating a similar encirclement strategy against the Americans. As Rodriguez continued his watch, the first mortar rounds began falling at exactly 5:30 in the morning. The explosions erupted across the airstrip in perfectly timed intervals, each blast sending geysers of red dirt and shrapnel into the morning sky. The siege of Khe Sanh had begun with deadly precision, and every Marine on the base knew they were now trapped in what would become one of the longest and most brutal confrontations of the Vietnam War. The initial barrage lasted 45 minutes, transforming the once quiet morning into a symphony of destruction. Marines scrambled from their bunkers to manning positions along the perimeter, their training taking over as adrenaline surged through their veins. The enemy had chosen their moment carefully. The base was shrouded in fog, limiting visibility and making it impossible for supporting aircraft to provide immediate assistance. Colonel Lones emerged from the command bunker, his steel helmet reflecting the orange glow of burning fuel drums hit by enemy mortars. His calm demeanor masked the gravity of their situation. Intelligence estimates suggested they were facing the full North Vietnamese Army divisions, potentially 20,000 enemy soldiers surrounding their isolated position. The battle for survival had begun, and every decision made in the coming hours would determine whether Khe Sanh became America's greatest defensive victory or its most devastating defeat in Southeast Asia. The second day of the siege brought with it a revelation that chilled every Marine to the bone. As the morning fog lifted on January 21st, 1968, the full scope of their predicament became horrifyingly clear. Captain James Morrison, commanding Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, raised his field glasses and felt his stomach drop. The hills surrounding Khe Sanh were alive with enemy activity, trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions that seemed to have materialized overnight like some nightmare vision. Jesus Christ, Morrison muttered under his breath, watching as North Vietnamese soldiers moved with mechanical precision through their fortified positions. The enemy had spent months preparing for this moment, digging an elaborate network of tunnels and firing positions that turned the surrounding landscape into a massive killing field. They weren't just under siege, they were trapped inside a carefully constructed death trap. Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes of the 1st Battalion, 13th Marines Artillery Unit, was coordinating fire missions from his position in the main fire direction center when the reality of their situation hit him like a physical blow. The base's 8-inch howitzers and 105mm guns were their lifeline, but ammunition supplies were already becoming a critical concern. Every round fired would need to count, because resupply missions were about to become exponentially more dangerous. The North Vietnamese had positioned their artillery with devastating effectiveness. Heavy mortars, rockets, and artillery pieces were dug into the reverse slopes of Hill 881 and Hill 888, making them nearly impossible to spot from the air and extremely difficult to neutralize. The enemy gunners had registered their fires on every significant target within the base of the runway: ammunition dumps, fuel storage areas, and command bunkers. They could drop rounds anywhere they wanted with surgical precision. Lance Corporal Dennis Murphy, a radio operator with Echo Company, experienced the terror firsthand when enemy rockets began impacting. Near the main communications bunker, the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds became a constant soundtrack to life at Sanh, followed by the earth-shaking explosions. That sent Marines diving for whatever cover they could find. Murphy's job required him to maintain radio contact with higher headquarters, but the constant bombardment made simple communication an act of courage. The isolation was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of their predicament. Weather conditions in the Highland region during late January made aerial resupply extremely hazardous, with thick fog and low clouds grounding most aircraft for days at a time. When supply planes did attempt to land, they faced withering anti-aircraft fire from North Vietnamese positions that commanded clear views of the airstrip. Major General Rathon Tompkins, commanding the 3rd Marine Division, coordinated the relief efforts from his headquarters in Dong Ha. But the reality was stark. The Marines at Sanh were largely on their own. The enemy had chosen their timing perfectly, launching their siege during the monsoon season when weather would severely limit American air mobility and close air support capabilities. The first major ground probe came on the night of January 23rd, when North Vietnamese sappers attempted to penetrate the base's eastern perimeter. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself in a desperate firefight as enemy soldiers emerged from spider holes barely 50 meters from the Marine positions. The engagement lasted 3 hours, with grenades exploding like deadly fireworks in the darkness and the staccato rhythm of automatic weapons fire echoing across the base. Private First Class Anthony DeLuca, barely 19 years old and fresh from boot camp at Paris Island, discovered what combat really meant during that first night attack. Crouched in a fighting hole with his M16, watching muzzle flashes wink in the darkness like deadly fireflies, he understood that survival would require every ounce of training and luck he possessed. The romantic notions of warfare disappeared forever in those terrifying hours, replaced by the grim reality of kill or be killed. But they had held their positions, and the enemy probe had been repulsed. Colonel Lones knew this was just the beginning, a testing of American defenses before the main assault. The question wasn't if the North Vietnamese would attack in force, but when and whether his Marines could hold when they did. By February 1st, 1968, the siege of Sanh had transformed into a deadly routine that tested the limits of human endurance. The North Vietnamese bombardment had evolved into a precise science, with enemy gunners timing their barrages to coincide with supply drops, meal times, and shift changes. Every aspect of life on the base became a calculated risk that could result in sudden death or maiming. Corporal William Bear Thompson, a demolitions expert with the 1st Engineer Battalion, had spent the past week reinforcing bunkers and improving defensive positions under constant enemy fire. The red clay soil of the Highland Plateau made digging treacherous work. It turned to sticky mud during the frequent rain showers and dried to concrete hardness under the tropical sun. Every shovelful of dirt represented a small victory against the enemy's attempt to terrorize them into submission. The psychological warfare was as relentless as the physical bombardment. North Vietnamese loudspeakers positioned in the surrounding hills broadcast propaganda messages in English throughout the night, promising safe passage to any Marines who surrendered, and describing in graphic detail what would happen to those who continued to resist. The enemy wanted the defenders to know they were being watched constantly, that every movement was observed and potentially targeted. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Maria Santos, one of the few female personnel at the base, worked tirelessly in the underground medical bunker treating the steady stream of casualties. The wounded came in waves, victims of sniper fire, mortar fragments, and the occasional rocket attack that penetrated the base's defensive perimeter. Santos had trained for combat medicine, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of treating traumatic injuries. While enemy shells exploded overhead, the ammunition depot explosion on February 5th changed everything. At exactly 1340 hours, a North Vietnamese rocket scored a direct hit on the main ammunition storage area, creating a fireball visible from 20 kilometers away. The blast was so powerful, it knocked Marines off their feet throughout the base and shattered every piece of glass in the command bunkers. Secondary explosions continued for over an hour, as thousands of artillery rounds cooked off in sequence. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was conducting a patrol briefing when the depot exploded. The concussion wave threw him against a sandbag wall with enough force to crack to ribs, and the sound was unlike anything he had experienced in the tours of duty in Vietnam. As debris rained down from the sky-twisted metal fragments and unexploded ordnance, Rodriguez realized they had just lost approximately 40% of their total ammunition reserves. The loss of the ammunition depot forced Colonel Lones to make difficult tactical decisions. Artillery fire missions had to be prioritized for only the most critical targets, and Marines were ordered to conserve small arms ammunition for confirmed enemy contact. The North Vietnamese had achieved a strategic victory without setting foot inside the base perimeter, severely limiting the defenders' ability to respond to future attacks. Weather conditions during early February added another layer of misery to the siege. Monsoon rains turned the base into a sea of red mud that clung to everything like thick paste. Marines lived in conditions that resembled the trenches of World War I, constantly wet, cold, and surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and curdite. Foot infections and skin diseases became epidemic. As basic hygiene became nearly impossible to maintain, the enemy's tactics evolved throughout the siege, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. Snipers targeted specific individuals, officers, radio operators, and senior enlisted personnel with the goal of disrupting command and control functions. Every movement during daylight hours required careful planning and coordination, as North Vietnamese observers in the surrounding hills could call down accurate artillery fire. Within minutes, Lance Corporal Chen discovered the enemy's precision firsthand when he attempted to repair a damaged radio antenna on the morning of February 7th. The sniper's bullet missed his head by inches, embedding itself in a wooden post directly behind his position. The message was clear: they were being hunted by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Despite the constant danger and deteriorating conditions, Marine morale remained surprisingly high. The shared experience of surviving under such extreme conditions created bonds between the defenders that transcended rank, race, and regional backgrounds. They were Americans fighting for their lives in a foreign land, and that simple reality united them in ways that peacetime service could never achieve. The siege was becoming a test of national will as much as military capability. Every day they held Sanh represented a victory against an enemy that had chosen the time, place, and conditions of battle. The question was whether American resolve would prove stronger than North Vietnamese determination, and whether the Marines could continue to endure the relentless pressure without breaking. The morning of January 30th, 1968 brought shocking news that recontextualized the siege of Sanh within a much larger strategic framework. As Staff Sergeant Rodriguez huddled in the communications bunker listening to radio reports from across South Vietnam, the scope of North Vietnamese planning became terrifyingly clear. The Tet Offensive had begun with coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns throughout the country, and Sanh was just one piece of an enormous strategic puzzle. Captain Morrison received the intelligence briefing with growing alarm. While his Marines had been focused on surviving the daily bombardment and probing attacks around their isolated base, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces had launched the largest military operation of the entire Vietnam conflict. Cities from Saigon to Da Nang were under attack, and American forces throughout the country were fighting desperate battles to maintain control of urban areas they had considered secure. The revelation that Sanh might be an elaborate deception operation designed to draw American attention and resources away from the real targets added a new dimension of uncertainty to their situation. Intelligence analysts at Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters were debating whether the siege represented the main effort of North Vietnamese strategy or merely a diversionary attack intended to fix American forces in place while the enemy struck more valuable targets elsewhere. General Westmoreland faced an agonizing decision that would define his legacy. As a military commander, the siege of Sanh had already consumed enormous resources: B-52 bomber strikes, artillery support, and aerial resupply missions that represented millions of dollars in military assets. If the base was indeed a diversion, those resources might be desperately needed to defend South Vietnamese cities under attack during the Tet Offensive. According to extensive analysis published in the Washington Post following the conflict, the strategic debate surrounding Sanh revealed fundamental disagreements within the American military establishment about North Vietnamese intentions and capabilities. Some commanders believed General Giap was attempting to recreate his victory at Dien Bien Phu, while others argued the siege was designed to distract attention from the urban uprising component of the Tet Offensive. Sergeant Hayes, coordinating artillery fire missions from his position in the Fire Direction Center, noticed a significant change in enemy tactics beginning in early February. The North Vietnamese seemed less interested in probing attacks against the base perimeter and more focused on maintaining pressure through constant bombardment. This shift suggested they were content to pin down American forces, rather than attempting to overrun the position through direct assault. The psychological impact on the defenders was profound. Marines who had been told they were defending a strategically vital position suddenly questioned whether their sacrifice served any meaningful purpose. If Sanh was merely a sideshow designed to distract American attention from the real battles, were they dying for a meaningless piece of real estate in the middle of nowhere? Lance Corporal Murphy, monitoring radio communications between Sanh and higher headquarters, heard fragments of conversations that revealed the strategic confusion surrounding their situation. Senior officers were openly debating whether to continue defending the base or attempt a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions closer to major population centers. The uncertainty was almost as demoralizing as the constant enemy fire. The siege took on new urgency as reports filtered in about the intensity of fighting. In South Vietnamese cities, the ancient capital of Hue had been largely occupied by North Vietnamese forces, and American Marines were engaged in house-to-house combat to retake the city. Saigon itself had been penetrated by enemy commandos who attacked the American embassy and other high-value targets throughout the capital. Private First Class DeLuca found himself wondering whether his family back home in Pennsylvania understood what was happening in Vietnam. The news reports about Tet made it seem like the entire country was falling apart, while the siege of Sanh represented just one small part of a much larger military catastrophe. The war that American political leaders had claimed was nearly won suddenly appeared to be spiraling out of control. Colonel Lones maintained outward confidence in his daily briefings to subordinate commanders, but privately he struggled with the implications of the strategic situation. His Marines were performing magnificently under impossible conditions, but their courage and sacrifice might ultimately prove irrelevant. If the North Vietnamese achieved their larger objectives in the cities of South Vietnam, the enemy seemed to understand the psychological dimension of their strategy perfectly. By forcing Americans to defend Sanh while simultaneously attacking urban areas throughout South Vietnam, they had created a no-win situation for American commanders. Every resource devoted to defending the remote base was unavailable for protecting South Vietnamese cities, while abandoning Sanh would represent a devastating propaganda victory for North Vietnamese forces. As February progressed and the Tet Offensive continued to rage across South Vietnam, the Marines at Sanh found themselves fighting not just for survival, but for the credibility of American strategy in Southeast Asia. Their isolated battle had become a symbol of everything right and wrong. With the American approach to the Vietnam conflict, tremendous individual courage and tactical competence undermined by strategic confusion and misplaced priorities. By mid-February 1968, the defenders of Sanh had endured nearly a month of constant bombardment, and the signs of prolonged stress were becoming impossible to ignore. Hospital Corpsman Santos documented the physical and psychological toll in her daily medical reports. Marines suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic sleep deprivation, and the early stages of malnutrition as supply shortages began affecting food distribution. The enemy had refined their tactics to maximize psychological pressure on the defenders. North Vietnamese gunners had learned to time their bombardments to disrupt sleep cycles, launching intense barrages at random intervals throughout the night. Marines never knew when the next attack would come, creating a state of hypervigilance that left even the most experienced veterans emotionally exhausted. Corporal Thompson, the demolitions expert, had spent weeks reinforcing bunkers and defensive positions, but the constant bombardment was gradually wearing down even the most robust fortifications. The red clay soil that provided excellent protection, when properly prepared, also absorbed water like a sponge during the frequent rain showers, causing bunker walls to collapse and fighting positions to become muddy death traps. The ammunition shortage created by the depot explosion forced Marines to make life-or-death decisions about when to engage enemy targets. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself ordering his men to hold their fire unless they had confirmed kills, a tactical constraint that went against every instinct developed during combat training. The psychological pressure of watching enemy soldiers move through the wire without being able to respond was almost unbearable. Food supplies had dwindled to emergency rations supplemented by whatever could be airdropped. During the brief periods when weather conditions permitted aerial resupply missions, Marines were losing weight at an alarming rate, and Colonel Lones worried that malnutrition would soon begin affecting combat effectiveness. The enemy seemed determined to starve them into submission if direct assault proved too costly. The breaking point came during the night of February 23rd, when North Vietnamese forces launched their most coordinated attack of the entire siege. For 6 hours, Marines fought desperate hand-to-hand combat as enemy soldiers attempted to establish permanent footholds inside the base perimeter. Lance Corporal Chen found himself in a life-or-death struggle with a North Vietnamese sapper, who had crawled through the wire carrying satchel charges intended to destroy the main communications bunker. Chen eventually prevailed, but the experience left him questioning how much more he could endure. Captain Morrison coordinated the defense from his company command post, directing Marines to threaten sectors while enemy mortars exploded around his position. The attack was clearly designed to test American resolve at its lowest point, after weeks of constant pressure had worn down physical strength and mental resilience. Morrison realized that this might be the enemy's final attempt to break their will to resist. The Marine response to the crisis demonstrated the resilience that had sustained them throughout the siege. Despite ammunition shortages, physical exhaustion, and overwhelming enemy pressure, the defenders held every critical position and eventually drove off the attackers. The cost was steep: 12 Marines killed and 43 wounded. But Khe Sanh remained in American hands. Private First Class DeLuca, who had arrived at the base as a frightened teenager, emerged from the night battle as a seasoned combat veteran. The transformation wasn't unique. Every Marine at Khe Sanh had been forged by the extreme conditions into something harder and more capable than they had ever imagined possible. The siege had stripped away everything non-essential, revealing the core strength that would sustain them through whatever challenges remained. The aftermath of the February 23rd attack marked a turning point in the siege. North Vietnamese forces seemed less willing to risk direct assault after suffering heavy casualties. During their most determined effort to overrun American positions, the enemy settled into a pattern of harassment through bombardment, while apparently preparing for either a final massive assault or a gradual withdrawal. Colonel Lones used the relative lull in enemy activity to reorganize his defenses and address the most critical supply shortages. Medical evacuations resumed on a limited basis, allowing the most seriously wounded Marines to be transported to hospitals in Da Nang in Japan. The sight of helicopters successfully landing and taking off provided an enormous morale boost. To the remaining defenders, weather conditions began improving in late February, allowing for more frequent aerial resupply missions and close air support sorties. B-52 bombers conducted massive strikes against suspected North Vietnamese positions in the surrounding hills, dropping thousands of tons of explosives in an effort to disrupt enemy logistics and communications. The psychological effect of the bombing campaigns was as important as the physical damage. Marines could hear and feel American air power working on their behalf. The siege had become a battle of wills between two determined adversaries, each testing the other's resolve to continue fighting under increasingly difficult conditions. The North Vietnamese had demonstrated their ability to sustain complex military operations far from their supply bases, while the Americans had proven they could endure extreme hardship without surrendering strategically important positions. The question was which side would reach their breaking point first. March 1st, 1968 brought the first clear indication that the siege of Khe Sanh was entering its final phase. Intelligence reports suggested significant North Vietnamese troop movements away from the base, and the intensity of enemy bombardment had decreased noticeably from the peak levels experienced during February. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez noticed the change immediately. The incoming rounds were less frequent and seemed less accurately targeted than during the height of the siege. The improvement in weather conditions allowed for unprecedented levels of American air support. Operation Niagara Falls, the massive B-52 bombing campaign directed at North Vietnamese positions around Khe Sanh, had dropped over 100,000 tons of explosives on suspected enemy locations. The psychological effect on both sides was enormous. Marines could feel the ground shake from the massive explosions, while North Vietnamese forces endured constant terror from attacks they couldn't predict or defend against. Captain Morrison received orders to begin limited offensive operations for the first time since the siege began. Small unit patrols were authorized to probe enemy positions and gather intelligence about North Vietnamese intentions. The shift from purely defensive operations to limited offensive action represented a fundamental change in the tactical situation and provided a huge boost to Marine morale. Corporal Thompson led one of the first reconnaissance patrols outside the base perimeter. In over 6 weeks, what they discovered confirmed intelligence reports about enemy withdrawal that elaborate bunker systems and artillery positions that had dominated the surrounding hills were largely abandoned. Equipment and supplies had been removed with military efficiency, leaving behind only empty fighting positions and discarded ammunition. The North Vietnamese withdrawal wasn't complete, but it was systematic and well organized. Enemy forces maintained enough presence to continue harassing the base, with occasional mortar attacks and sniper fire. But the massive concentration of troops that had threatened to overrun Sanh was clearly moving to other operational areas. General Giap had apparently decided that the siege had served its strategic purpose. Hospital Corpsman Santos began seeing different types of casualties as the siege entered its final weeks. Instead of the traumatic wounds caused by mortar fragments and rocket explosions, she was treating Marines suffering from exhaustion, malnutrition, and various tropical diseases that had flourished in the unsanitary conditions of the besieged base. The human cost of the 7 to 7 day siege was becoming clear even before the fighting ended. Lance Corporal Murphy monitored radio communications as American forces throughout South Vietnam began recovering from the Tet Offensive. The coordinated attacks on South Vietnamese cities had been repulsed with heavy casualties on both sides, but the psychological impact on American public opinion was proving more significant than the military results. The siege of Sanh had become a symbol of American determination, but also of the seemingly endless nature of the Vietnam conflict. Operation Pegasus, the relief operation designed to break the siege definitively, began on April 1st with the deployment of the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile and additional Marine units. The multi-division operation represented the largest American military effort of the entire Vietnam War, involving over 30,000 soldiers and Marines supported by massive air and artillery assets. The irony wasn't lost on the defenders of Sanh. They had held the base through the worst period of the siege with approximately 6,000 Marines, but it would take 5 times that number to officially end the enemy threat. The relief operation demonstrated both the strategic importance that senior commanders attached to Sanh and the enormous resources required to conduct military operations. In the difficult terrain of northern South Vietnam, Private First Class DeLuca watched the first relief columns approach the base with mixed emotions. Pride in surviving one of the longest sieges in American military history was tempered by grief for the Marines who hadn't lived to see this moment. The camaraderie forged during 7 to 7 days of constant danger would bind the survivors together for the rest of their lives, but it had come at a terrible cost. Colonel Lones conducted his final briefing for subordinate commanders on April 6, 1968, exactly 7 to 7 days after the siege began. His Marines had held their positions against overwhelming odds, suffered casualties that would have broken lesser units, and maintained their fighting effectiveness despite conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance. They had written a chapter in Marine Corps history that would be studied by military professionals for decades to come. The strategic assessment of the siege would remain controversial for years after the Vietnam War ended. Critics argue that Sanh had indeed been an elaborate deception that diverted American attention and resources from more important objectives during the Tet Offensive. Supporters maintained that the successful defense demonstrated American resolve and prevented North Vietnamese forces from achieving a propaganda victory that might have shortened the war on unfavorable terms. The human cost was undeniable: over 100 Marines killed and thousands wounded during the siege, with additional casualties during the relief operation. The North Vietnamese losses were estimated at 10 to 15,000 killed, though exact numbers would never be confirmed. Both sides had demonstrated their willingness to accept enormous casualties for strategic objectives that remained poorly defined and difficult to measure. As the siege officially ended and normal operations resumed at Sanh, the survivors began the long process of returning to something resembling normal military life. But the experience had changed them permanently, creating bonds and memories that would influence their perspectives on war, courage, and sacrifice for the rest of their lives. April 8, 1968 marked the official end of the siege of Sanh, but the true conclusion of this epic confrontation would unfold over months and years. As its strategic and psychological implications became clear, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood on the newly reopened airstrip, watching transport planes land with fresh supplies and reinforcements, and reflected on how profoundly the experience had changed every Marine who had endured those 7 to 7 days of hell. The statistics told only part of the story. American casualties during the siege included 205 killed and over 1,500 wounded, while North Vietnamese losses were estimated between 10,000 and 15,000 killed. The material cost was equally staggering: millions of dollars in military equipment destroyed, thousands of tons of supplies consumed, and resources that might have been deployed elsewhere during the critical period of the Tet Offensive. But numbers couldn't capture the human dimension of what had occurred at this remote outpost in the highlands of South Vietnam. Captain Morrison, preparing to rotate back to the United States after completing his tour of duty, understood that he had participated in something that transcended normal military experience. The siege had tested every aspect of American military capability and individual character under conditions that few conflicts in history had imposed on combatants. The controversy over whether Sanh had been worth defending would rage for decades. Among military historians and strategic analysts, General Westmoreland maintained until his death that the successful defense had prevented a North Vietnamese victory that would have had catastrophic consequences for American credibility in Southeast Asia. Critics argued that the base had no genuine strategic value and that the resources devoted to its defense had been wasted on a meaningless tactical exercise. Hospital Corpsman Santos completed her medical reports, documenting the long-term health effects of the siege on its survivors. Beyond the obvious physical wounds, she identified patterns of psychological trauma that would later be recognized as classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The men who had held Sanh would carry the mental scars of their experience for the rest of their lives, often struggling to readjust to civilian society after witnessing the extremes of human endurance and violence. The North Vietnamese perspective on the siege remained largely hidden from Western analysts for decades after the war ended. When former North Vietnamese Army officers finally began discussing their strategic thinking, they revealed that Sanh had indeed served multiple purposes, tying down American forces during the Tet Offensive while testing American resolve to defend isolated positions under extreme pressure. The siege had been both a diversion and a genuine attempt to inflict maximum casualties on American forces. Lance Corporal Chen received the Bronze Star for his actions during the night attack of February 23rd, but he would later say that the medal meant less to him than the knowledge that he had not let down his fellow Marines during their moment of greatest need. The courage displayed by thousands of individual Marines during the siege represented the best traditions of American military service. Even as the larger strategic context of the Vietnam War became increasingly controversial, the tactical lessons learned at Sanh would influence American military doctrine for generations. The importance of logistics in sustained defensive operations, the psychological effects of prolonged bombardment on combat effectiveness, and the challenges of coordinating multi-service operations in difficult terrain all became standard subjects in military staff colleges and war colleges throughout the United States. Corporal Thompson returned to his hometown in Ohio as a decorated veteran, but found that many Americans were beginning to question the entire Vietnam enterprise. The siege of Sanh had occurred during a period when public support for the war was declining rapidly, and even military victories were viewed with skepticism by growing segments of the American population. The disconnect between military performance and public perception would haunt Vietnam veterans for decades. The abandonment of Sanh just 3 months after the siege ended added another layer of controversy to the entire episode. In July 1968, American forces withdrew from the base and destroyed the facilities they had defended at such enormous cost. Critics saw this as confirmation that the strategic value of the position had been exaggerated, while supporters argued that changing tactical conditions had made the base unnecessary. Once North Vietnamese forces withdrew from the region, Private First Class DeLuca, now a seasoned combat veteran despite his youth, understood that he had been part of something historically significant. The siege of Sanh would be remembered as one of the defining battles of the Vietnam War, a 7 to 7 day test of American military capability and individual courage under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Whether that sacrifice had been strategically justified would be debated by historians and military analysts for generations to come. The legacy of Sanh extended far beyond the immediate tactical and strategic consequences of the siege itself. The battle had demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of American military power. In the Vietnam conflict, tremendous individual courage and tactical competence undermined by strategic confusion and unclear objectives. The Marines who held the base had performed magnificently, but their sacrifice occurred within a larger strategic framework that remained deeply problematic. As the survivors of the siege dispersed to new assignments or returned to civilian life, they carried with them memories of an experience that had tested the limits of human endurance. They had held an isolated outpost against overwhelming odds, maintained their fighting effectiveness despite conditions that would have broken lesser units, and demonstrated the courage and resilience that represent the best traditions of American military service. The siege of Sanh had ended, but its impact on the men who fought there and on the American understanding of war itself would continue for decades to come. The Battle of Sanh stands as a testament to the courage, determination, and sacrifice of the United States Marines who endured 7 days of hell in defense of a principle they believed in, even when the strategic wisdom of that defense remained controversial. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a military engagement, but as a profound human drama that revealed both the nobility and tragedy of war itself.